Welcome to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode we're going to be talking about bees, the mysterious disappearance. Did you know that in 2004 and 2005 bees were disappearing from all over North America? Let's take a look at some of the DVD nicotine bees.
Now let's take a look here.
Bees at the front of the hive are guard bees, and if I do a little puff of smoke here and a puff of smoke there, you can hear them buzz a little bit, and the guard bees all go into the hive and they're going to gorge on honey. Now the bees glue everything together with this sticky stuff called propolis. Propolis has a lot of medicinal properties in it. If you chew on it when you have a sore throat, it numbs your throat. So here's the queen right here. What she's doing right now is she's wandering around and she's looking for a cell that's empty so she can lay some eggs. And that's her primary job, is to just lay eggs in the hive. And as she wanders around, you'll see different bees will come up and they'll start to touch her, and they'll get her smell, and they'll pass that smell around inside the hive. And every bee in the hive has to get her smell every 45 minutes. If it goes for more than 45 minutes and they don't get that queen smell, then they know that something happened to the queen and they have to raise a new queen immediately. Here we see capped brood. This is the pupa. We can get the bees to move away by just tapping them on their back shoulders. The brood are the babies. And you can see how this is a solid pattern. So we call this a nice brood pattern. What a shotgun pattern is when there's only capped brood here and there, where there's a lot of empty holes.
Yeah, these are brood cells right here. And the shotgun effect of empty cells may be indicative of something else too. Normally that should be pretty solid.
Most of the bees in the hive are worker bees, and the worker bees are all females. Some of them go in and do house cleaning. Some of them feed the young babies. Some of them make wax. And here's another caste. This is not a worker. This is one of the boys. This is a drone. The drones don't do any work in the hive. In fact, most of the time they go around and beg for food from their sisters.
It's just like with humans, they like to be fed and only think about sex with the queens. You can see the drone is bigger, has these bigger eyes, and doesn't have a stinger.
There's a professor in Germany that has developed IQ tests for bees, and for certain tests the individual bee will outperform a dog. Okay? It's really impressive what the bees can do individually and certainly as a colony. It's a super organism. They're not this intelligent so that they can enjoy art and opera, you know. Being this intelligent is essential for their survival. They work a field systematically. They have a language. A bee finds something attractive on that field, comes home to the hive, shares this with the other bees, does the famous figure eight dance to tell everybody in the hive where to find this good stuff, and they're all going there. They don't care what is blooming along the way.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode is about a couple of great guests. I have Claudia Henriquez, who is with the Gateway Green Alliance. Claudia, thank you so much for coming on the show this evening.
Thanks for having
And
me.
I also have Sarah Heyman, who is a cell biologist at Washington University. Sarah, thanks so much. Now let me ask you, Claudia, why is it that species, we saw a little bit about bee behavior, about the way that bees interact and how they live in the hive. Why is it that all of a sudden a species would decline in its numbers?
Well, throughout the history of the Earth, we've had 5 mass extinctions that have been brought about by glaciation cycles, or the impact of major asteroids, or enormous volcanic eruptions. Right now, we are in the midst of what scientists are beginning to call the 6th mass extinction. And the difference between this one and the others is that the sole cause of this mass extinction is human activity.
And so when we think, in the next segment, we're going to see something about the bee decline. In other words, it's very likely that there's something about human activity that led to this bee decline that we're going to that we're going to learn about.
Absolutely, and not only the bee decline, I mean, it's hundreds, if not thousands of species that are declining at the same or even faster rates. Such, the frogs of Central America.
Why would frogs be declining?
Well, at first they were trying to, it's always human activity, and they were saying at first that it could be habitat loss, invasive species, or disease, but they were finding that frogs were declining in even pristine environments. And so a study looked at the effects of UVB rays, ultraviolet rays, in conjunction with other stressors such as predation, and they found that the increased levels of UV radiation significantly affected the fitness of the frogs. It made them less fit, basically.
Does that have anything to do with climate change, or what could be causing that?
Well, the increased UV radiation is a direct effect of the loss of stratospheric ozone.
Oh, it's the ozone effects, not climate change.
Right.
Okay.
But ozone
Ozone is
depletion is a climate effect.
Okay.
It's an anthropogenic climate effect,
So-
or
so- but-
human-caused climate change.
So when we're talking about species, we can't assume that every species declines because of that.
Well, so that is affecting the frogs, but another organism are coral reefs.
Okay,
I mean,
and
coral
coral are
reefs-
living animals, correct?
Coral are living animals, and they are becoming bleached at ever-increasing rates because of solar radiation. It's warming the temperatures.
So
and they're
that's
dying.
very directly and clearly global warming than a climate change. That's
And you add to that, what they're finding is siltation, due to the fact that we're doing a lot of development in areas that had previously not been developed, so there's a lot more.
so if you have a lot of dust floating around the air and it settles into the water, that's not good for coral.
Also erosion, that'll do the same thing, and what's called eutrophication. That's a big fancy word for meaning there's a lot of fertilizer that's running off of our lawns and running off of our fields, crop fields, that's making it especially bad for the
Okay,
coral.
well, Sarah, what about insects? Are there any examples that you can think of where an insect population declines?
There are tremendous numbers of insects that have already gone extinct. Part of the problem is that we don't study insects as much as we study the big, beautiful animals like the tigers or even the coral reef, because we
Insects
see them.
crawl on us when we want to get rid of them, right?
Right. We tend,
So we
to,
don't-
we tend to just associate them with icky things.
Right.
But in truth, they're critical for not just for being food for other animals, but also for putting together and holding up our ecosystem. They're what helps us make soil. They're what helps us pollinate. Well, they spread pollen from plant to plant that gives us do important things like breaking down a lot of the vegetation, like a fallen tree is broken down by a great many of these. Also, they're important in ways that we don't think of in terms of keeping together. They're like the mortar that keeps the bricks of all these
Right,
other
well-
animals together.
Well, I would just think if you like birds, what do birds eat?
Right. It's very important.
It's insects, and so if you don't have any insects, you have a lot of starving birds.
And if there are very specific insects that are important to very specific birds, like a gnatcatcher eats only these very small insects, well, if they're wiped out, then that bird has nothing to eat.
Well, and half of the crops that we eat are insect pollinated. I mean, we wouldn't have half of our diet if it wasn't for these insects.
Right, a friend of mine was telling me years ago that you need to get wasp in your garden. And a lot of people just think of, wasp as something that I want to get rid of, but if there's no wasp, that really decreases the pollination a lot.
Well, and you add to it that it decreases or it increases the bad bugs. Wasps are terrific predators. They're like the tigers of the insect world. They're ferocious, and they'll take on anything.
Except they tend not to sting people unless you step on them, right?
You have to work pretty hard at making a wasp mad. You can do it. I've done it, but I wouldn't recommend doing it.
Okay, let's take a break, and we're going to see some more of nicotine bees in an announcement, and we're going to come back and talk about the bee decline.
Bees are not as healthy as they used to be. The environment is not as good as it used to be. I can maintain colonies only by constantly splitting them and putting new queens in. And I've heard other beekeepers say that that's the only way they're staying in business now, too.
Well, I can tell you what happened a couple years ago when we had the 50% bee losses in the wintertime. When it came time for the blueberry pollination, the apples, everybody was calling and trying to find bees. Most of the apple orchards that had their own bees, they lost them all.
In a normal thriving hive, this would be nearly solid. They're definitely weak.
The most challenging part for a bee colony and the beekeeper managing it is getting the colony healthy through the winter.
This one's very weak. And strangely enough, it was the strongest colony going into winter.
If something bad happens during the summer, you don't necessarily notice anything, but it will show up in the winter losses.
No new brood, and from what I can see, there are no eggs or anything being started. This time of year in a healthy colony, those should be practically solid with brood.
In the past, a good winter was if you lost maybe 3% of your colonies, and a bad winter was if you lost 10% of your colonies.
Years ago, bees with very little maintenance would remain healthy here, and I rarely had losses over the winter of 15%. Now I always have losses in the range of 30%, and this past winter it was 40%.
By 2006, huge numbers of bees were dying simultaneously on a global scale. Worldwide, many bees acted in the same strange ways before they died. The United States lost half of its bee colonies. In Germany and France, losses reached 40%. Canadian beekeepers lost half of their colonies, all in the span of a few months. Despite the huge losses, few honeybee bodies were found. This strange pattern was new. Everyone was losing bees, from small hobby beekeepers to the largest commercial beekeepers.
By September, late September, early October, we truck all the bees back to Florida. From up north here, everything goes back. My son went back to Florida and right after Christmas, calls me on the phone, says, forget shipping bees to California. All these bees we put this honey on, there's something wrong with them. They're just, they're down to a couple hands full of bees. My son gets on the forklift, I light up a smoker, I start smoking these pallets of bees, and after I smoke 4 or 5 pallets of bees, I realize something's telling me there's no bees on the entrance, there's no nothing. And I just started jerking covers open and frantically started opening beehives, and there's nobody there. I get down on my hands and knees. I mean, we're talking about gravel. We're not on the sand, we're not in grass, we're in gravel. I get down on my hands and knees and literally look for bees on the ground because there's no bodies. The ground would have been just that thick with bees. If you have a spray kill or something where somebody sprayed you, or the mites got you, if you had a mite problem, there'd be dead bees laying out in front of the ground. The brood that was left behind would be all full of holes where the mites were in that stuff. There was none of that. There's no wax moth, and there's no small hive beetles. And in Florida, that time of year, the wax moth, if a hive is dying, the wax moth have already moved in. They eat the wax. They're not there. Now wait a minute, there's something strange, weird here.
I'm only in the pollination business. I've been taking bees out for pollination for over 20 years. So in the year 2000, over the winter of 1999 and 2000 and 2001, I lost 1,000 colonies. And now I have about 100 colonies left.
By 99, yeah, I was experiencing a lot of die-off. And what it was is it was colonies collapsing in the summertime, which is unusual.
The definition of colony collapse disorder is when you have a healthy hive, lots of brood, lots of worker bees, and within a very short period of time, all of the adult bees leave the nest and go somewhere, and all that you're left with is a queen and a handful of young worker bees. You have a large number of capped brood, but no, all the adult bees have left.
They had a big population earlier, and then suddenly their population had collapsed. There was no adult bees, and the brood then came down with diseases.
But here's a hive of bees that should look like the rest of these, with lots of bees flying in and out. And yesterday, my son was working these and said this was a hive of CCD, and we'll take a look at it.
Something clearly happened around 2004, 2005 that sort of served as a tipping point and pushed many of the beehives in North America and in Europe over the edge to where all of a sudden and inexplicably the bees would take off in the morning and never come back.
There's no old bees here. These are all real young. So something's happening. The old bees are disappearing. You look at these are nice little warm looking fuzzy fellows. They're the ones that have just hatched out.
They would just disappear. Very few of their bodies would be found. And a hive would go from one day seemingly healthy, full of a few thousand bees, and the next day they're gone.
A normal bee lives about 6 weeks.
Collapses in China, collapses in South America. France, Germany have had die-offs. A lot of the beekeepers there are blaming it on pesticides.
2 weeks ago, I was at a bee house just like this, about 30 kilometers away from here, and there were kilos of dead bees on the ground. And that was because this farmer had the bee house just like here, next to a flowering pasture. And year after year, everything was fine. And this year, the farmer that owned the pasture in front of the bee house decided to turn it over and plant corn. And the corn was treated with poncho, and the result was dead bees.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz, and with me I have, I'll just remind you of the guest, we have Sarah Heyman, who is an entomologist working in biology department at Washington University. And we have Claudia Henriquez, who is a member of the Gateway Green Alliance and also studying biology. Okay, well, we just saw some on the DVD, Nicotine Bees, about the great decline of bees in 2004 and 2005. Why was that strange?
Well, for starters, bees are a domesticated animal. And when
we don't think of that, do we? We think of bees as just a totally
Right.
wild, like wasp and grasshoppers and everything else, but they're
No, these are domesticated. They're just like cattle or sheep.
They're introduced into the country. They are not native insects at all.
And that's really important. They were, and I think the DVD points out something that you know, bees were brought over with a lot of the plants because we couldn't have things like apples and a lot of other orchards if there weren't bees.
Yeah.
Right, and the important thing to remember is that since they're cultivated, since they're domesticated, this is why, one of the reasons why this collapse is so startling and why it's upsetting to people is because it would be as if, imagine as if all the cattle were one day grazing out on the back of your pasture, and then the next day they're all lying down dead, or they just all vanished.
Disappeared.
Yeah, they've been vacuumed up and gone. Mm-hmm. And that would be just about the same thing or the same sort of impact.
And like they said, I mean, there was a sort of normal amount of loss per year, you know,
Right,
3
I think what
to
they say
15%,
10%,
3 to 10%.
Yeah.
And that was normal, but to all of a sudden jump to 40, 50, 90% is...
So it wasn't a complete extermination of bees, but they were just disappearing at an incredible rate in 2004 and 2005.
Yeah, it's as if you had 100 cows, and then they're out grazing along, and the next day you come out and you have 10 cows left out of that 100.
And then one cow body, and the others have disappeared.
Right, right. You know, literally, if you're talking about a 90% loss, you go from 100 cows to having 10 cows, or something.
And you haven't changed your practices
Nothing
at
has
all.
happened.
Nothing that you have done has changed. something external.
Are there any other examples that you can think of with insects that have had population declines?
Yeah, there are quite a few. One of the classic ones is what's happened in the San Francisco area. And we can directly attribute this to the development of the suburbs in these areas. There are certain particular types of butterflies that are very beautiful, but they're unique to this area because the soils are very unusual right around the Bay Area, right around San Francisco. They're called serpentine soils. And they have a particular greenish color, but they also grow particular plants on them. And these butterflies just sort of amble around and live on the nectar of these plants, and they leave their eggs on these plants. Well, the more you had this area developed, the less and less area there was left with these wild plants. And as a result, basically they've wiped out a great many of these butterflies that were native to this area.
And what was it that got rid of the plants?
It was the development of the suburbia. You paved them.
Okay.
You put a house where there.
Okay, just development. There's a lot fewer plants, and so if you have a lot fewer plants, you have a lot fewer butterflies.
Right. Exactly. So, but it was a direct link to human-caused crash of this particular group of butterflies.
So, did it take people very long to figure it out, or was that pretty obvious?
Well, it took them a long time to figure out that the butterflies were going, because as much as many people liked the butterflies, they still saw them. They just suddenly started realizing there aren't very many butterflies anymore. And why aren't there very many butterflies anymore? And it didn't take good biologists very long to figure it out, but it hasn't necessarily stopped it from being a problem.
Claudia, you mentioned before that frogs have disappeared, or a lot of parts of the world frogs have decreased at an amazing rate. Can you think of any other species that have declined in the last few decades?
So there's the coral reefs, and then
coral reefs. We mentioned those.
The orangutan is also.
Oh, that's right. The orangutan is close to extinct in the native habitat.
Yes.
Where is that? Indonesia or
Asia?
It's Asia. Okay.
Southeast Asia.
And is that simply because the area where it lives is
just habitat loss?
It's just habitat loss.
It's habitat loss. Yeah, absolutely. It's development. Again, I mean, we're taking away space from thousands of other species so that one species, which is humans, the Homo sapien, can come and take over and have a place to live. I mean, as the population increases, we're only going to kill more and more species.
And of course, the problem for that is that all species are interrelated. And so as humans dominate other species, and as the number of other species decreases, that decreases the likelihood that humans will be able to survive.
Right. Well, it's a cascade effect, exactly. Right now we're increasing, but once, they're predicting by the year 2100, we're going to have over 50% of the species that exist now are going to be gone. And I mean, the ecosystems are intricate webs, and we are...
One quick question, because we're almost out of time. Once a species becomes extinct, how long does it take to come back?
It never comes back.
Sarah, do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Extinct is dead forever.
Okay.
Dead as a doornail.
And so if 50% of the species are lost,
we'll never
in 2100, then 50% of species would be gone. I want to thank everybody for tuning into this episode of Green Time. Be sure to look at the next episode when we're going to be talking about what could have caused this extinction of bees.